Credential Evaluation ABCs from easy to complicated. My name is Katerina Roskina, Senior Evaluator, China Credential Services. We work with Chinese credentials specifically, also doing consulting work for institutions, setting up double degree programs, vetting institutional partners, doing custom research, things like that. So evaluation plus, this is what we specialize in, but China. All right, so we'll get started promptly. The title of the session kind of gives you an impression that Chinese credential evaluation can be easy. And you may be wondering, well, I don't read Chinese. I don't speak Chinese. Can it ever possibly be easy in a situation where it's all Chinese to me? And the answer to that is actually yes. Chinese credentials can be complicated, and we will talk about that today. But there are situations and scenarios in which once you know what you're looking at and what you're dealing with, it actually becomes very straightforward. So hopefully this is reassuring. So first of all, this is step one. The educational system of China is actually called US based in the credential evaluation or comparative education industry. But what does it mean? We're going to look into that on the next slide. This table is a comparison of different levels of education within the Chinese educational system and the US educational system. So if we look at the left, we see our primary and secondary. Since for university admissions and credential evaluation, generally, we're not interested in primary credentials. I've dealt with one or two in my career. Secondary usually is our focus and the benchmark credential of a high school diploma. That's why they're combined in one line. Then you have your lower level undergraduate, your upper level undergraduate, or you could even say full cycle undergraduate programs, master's programs, and doctoral programs. So in the US, it is 12 years for primary and secondary, and in China it is as well. So here's your one level where it is US based, or very similar to the US educational system. The lower level undergraduate level, which would be your associate's degree programs generally, in the US it's 2 years. In China it's 2 to 3 years, so very similar model. Upper level undergraduate or full cycle undergraduate. I think there's a distinction. Upper level, there are also upper level programs that happen after lower level undergraduate programs, but for the purposes of the demonstration right now, we're going to talk about undergraduate programs that include the upper level coursework. Those generally have 4 years. Those would be your bachelor's degree programs, and in China they're 4 to 5 years in length, so also extremely similar. For master's programs, in the US you generally go a year plus, depending on the mode of delivery and things like that. In China, it's generally 3 years if it's a combined bachelor's, master's, or master's doctorate. That time period can be reduced, but the general model is, again, similar, not necessarily identical. And for doctorate programs, the minimum duration in the US is 3 years, even though generally they take longer due to multiple factors. And in China, it is a 3-year standard. So if we look at these two models, they are extremely similar, and that's part of what makes evaluating Chinese credentials very straightforward. Now let's look at the credentials and how to tell them apart. We're going to look at some samples later, but while formats of credentials in China vary quite substantially by time period, by level of education, by the type of program, for all sorts of things, the language on those credentials is very standard, and that's another thing that would make it very easy for you to navigate those credentials, because pretty much all transcripts are called these 3 characters, Chengjidan. There are some variations at the end. We're going to look at them too, but let me initiate an annotation here so I can highlight these 2 characters are almost 100% are going to be there no matter what on any statement of results. Then the diplomas will always contain these characters. There's no deviation from that, and usually the 4 of them, but there will be sometimes some rare instances where it would be 3 of them only. And then the degrees will always be this. So this is the fantastic thing about it. Like when you look at credentials from some other countries, say you will have your specific titles, even though it's a degree program, you would still have a different title for each level of education. In China, A bachelor's degree is still a bachelor's degree and is going to say so on the credential. A master's degree is going to say degree in the credential. A doctorate degree is going to say the same exact characters, and even though characters may not be your thing, once you kind of remember and have the visuals, it becomes really straightforward to take a look at the credentials and know what you're looking at. Now, as you see here, there are 2 red crosses in our last column of degrees. It's because at the primary and secondary level and at the lower level undergraduate, they don't issue degrees in China, which is kind of funky because when you think about undergraduate lower level programs in the United States, that's an associate's degree. In China, however, a degree does not accompany these programs. I don't know why, but that's just the way it is. So all you would expect from an associate's level program is a transcript and a diploma. So why is it important to sort of keep in mind what credentials to expect? It's because at every level, when you receive those credentials and you evaluate those credentials, you will need to know whether or not you have enough to actually proceed with admitting a student or assessing their preparedness for a program. And at the lower level undergraduate, you won't ask for a degree, even though your equivalence would likely be an associate's degree once you're done with it. And the primary, secondary, obviously not as well. So the trickiest one is this one because that's where it kind of differs from the US educational system. Now let me erase the annotations because it's getting a little messy, but this is the only one that we really have to really pay attention to. Now there is another level that we want to look at. What is the difference between the diploma and the degree? That part is sort of tricky because in the United States, you graduate from a program and you receive that degree certificate, or say in a high school case, you receive a high school diploma. What essentially a diploma means in Chinese, literally, 毕业证书 is a graduation certificate. So that's a certificate that confirms your graduation from the program. It means that you've completed and successfully passed examinations in all of the subjects. However, a degree goes a step further in the Chinese educational system. For bachelor's programs, master's programs, and doctoral programs, it also means that you're a good communist, which is irrelevant for our purposes, obviously. It also means that you have completed a thesis successfully, and most of the time, first try. And then you've reached a certain level of GPA in your major subjects. For instance, if you're majoring in physics, your physics subjects should have a minimum of 75%. For some institutions, it's higher, of GPA. It's not necessarily GPA because in China, the concept is a little different, but 75% overall results in your major subjects or higher. So there are a few other things like passing English proficiency examination, all those things. So until you're done with all that, you will not get the degree certificate. So essentially for us and for many evaluation agencies that I know of, EC I used to work for, it is important to have the degree to confirm degree eligibility. So it's not that you completed all the credits, as would be the case when you're looking at a diploma. You also completed other degree requirements. And for our purposes, a degree is necessary to confirm degree equivalence. All right, let us move on to the next thing. So you may be wondering, I'll be getting translations with all of that. Why do I even need the characters and anything that looks like characters? I'll just rely on the translations and be done with it. And there's a lot of truth to that. Dealing with translations is simple. There's no effort required. You're just reading in your native language. You don't need to speak or read another language, and it's a minimal time commitment to navigate that, comparing to navigating a native language document. However, there are frequently inaccuracies in translations. They can be interpretive. So a person can say, this person received a bachelor's degree. If you don't know what you're dealing with, you may believe that. And I've been in multiple situations where it was not necessarily deliberately done, but it was misleading in a way that that credential could be misinterpreted for the level it did not represent. And so a translation does not guarantee that the program is recognized or that a document is authentic. And you can only really get into the weeds of that by working with the original language documents. And again, it is impossible, especially for a generalist evaluator, to speak every single language, but there are certain markers that you can learn or at least have on your desk in sort of an assistive capacity to make sure that what you're looking at is indeed what you think you're looking at. So my suggestion would be, if you don't have a language proficiency, spot checking translations using those markers, and we will talk about those a little later, and I will actually share a file with you that will include that information. Look for credential titles specifically, look for level indicators, as in, you know, is it undergraduate, is it graduate? Look for specific red flags we'll also talk about today. So all of that in combination, while using the translations, being realistic about the process, will help you evaluate the credentials correctly. So here, I talked about how the credential titles are standardized, and that's the beauty of Chinese credentials, because as differently as they may appear visually, as you can see here, the characters that are used on them are the same. So you see that main part, the most standard part here, 成绩单, which means transcript. And then there's an extended version of that that has a slightly different character at the end, but the first two characters are still the same. So in that sense, whenever you're looking at something, I mean, obviously, common sense, it looks like a transcript. Quacks like a duck, it's a duck. But with that said, you can always ascertain that this is the credential you're looking at, regardless. Then we're moving on to our next type of credential, which is the diploma, and the same exact thing happens. At all levels of education at graduation, you will get a diploma, which is a graduation certificate. And that diploma will identify the level of education as well as the fact that this person graduated, and the characters are always the same. So when you're looking at it, you shouldn't be able to confuse it with a degree. And if a person is saying, oh, I have a degree, you will be able to definitively tell them, no, you have a graduation certificate or a diploma. And that can help you figure out how to evaluate and how to find an equivalence for that particular credential. And here are our degrees. As you can see, they vary quite greatly. The one in the top right corner here is an older format from the early 2000s. The one in the middle, I think, was mid 2000s, like 2008-ish. And the one in the bottom is one of the more modern custom formats that have been introduced in the past few years. But the characters are still the same, which is what makes evaluating Chinese credentials so darn easy. Well, to an extent, but still, looking at it, you know exactly what you have in your hand, and a translation can accompany and confirm that, and then you can move on to doing what you need to do. So credential formats, like I mentioned, they are unique in many ways. They're unique by period and year, by level of education, say secondary versus undergraduate versus graduate, and the mode of education, for instance, regular versus self-study. We're going to go over a couple of credentials above. Over here, slide we've already seen. On the left here, this is a self-study credential, which looks very different than the regular education credential, which is neat. If you ask me, visually, you already know what you're dealing with before you even read it, especially if you have a good visual memory. Now, as we're going here, again, different formats, but same characters, which makes it easier to navigate. And as you're learning craft, you will learn the time periods those formats belong to as well. Now, each credential, in addition to the credential title, has a ton of level indicators, and that is what can help you get, again, further into the weeds and figure out if the translation is accurate in representing the level of that credential. So you would have those characters over there at the top on the left are associated with secondary education, be it regular secondary education or vocational education. You have your lower level undergraduate credentials, with all sorts of different characters that you can look for. You have your full cycle undergraduate, 4 years. You have your upper level undergraduate, which follows after completing a lower level undergraduate program. You have your bachelor's degrees, your master's. So it looks like a handful or an eyeful, if you will, but in reality, there's just a finite number of those characters that you can use to your advantage to navigate and spot check your translations to make sure that they're accurate and you're not being misled deliberately or otherwise. So, okay, we figured out what we're looking at. Now what? Here comes the question of credential authenticity. And then the question of credential equivalence. Once you find out what the credential is, a lot of times you already know what to do next, especially when it comes to equivalence, because like we talked, this is a US-based system. So a lot of the credentials will have a direct equivalent, or you could say as direct as it can get in international comparative education. Credential authenticity is a different subject matter. So we will look at the most common avenues for verifying Chinese credentials. And they are called the CHESIC and the CDGDC. It's a mouthful, but they are two agencies that are affiliated with the Chinese Ministry of Education and verify Chinese credentials for third parties that need a verification. It could be for employment or further education. So those are authoritative agencies that we can rely on to provide us with accurate information. CHESIC verifies transcripts and diplomas, but not degrees. CDGDC verifies degrees, but not anything else. In the past, they used to overlap, and I always wondered about it, why. It seems redundant, but they've since gotten rid of the redundancy. It's important to remember that CHESIC does not verify secondary transcripts, which is unfortunate since a few years ago, but it is what it is. But they verify diplomas. They also verify Huikao results and Gaokao results, which are respectively high school graduation examination results and university entrance examination results. But for the most part, this is what you will get from those two agencies. They're extremely helpful. But if you don't have the capacity, student wouldn't provide it, you don't want to wait, you're in a tight deadline, you can try verifying on the university website. Not all universities by any means provide that. If you have a Chinese student worker, they can help you figure out if that's possible at all. You can try to contact the school in Chinese, obviously. You could try reaching out to the international department, but I don't know how far you might get. Again, you can utilize your student workers if you have them, or your colleagues who speak Chinese. You can verify via credential features. That, my friends, requires training and experience, because when I started at ECE, 12 years ago, I used to work at ECE with Robin and Lindsay. I would see a Chinese credential, I could read it in Chinese, but I did not know if it was authentic or not, because by that time, when I was just starting out as an evaluator, like you are now, Robin, I didn't know what to look for. All those features, it sounded correct, it said it's a degree, it means it's a degree, not necessarily. So that's where the more volume you process, the more credentials you deal with, you'll start sort of having an eye for those features, the characteristic features that are supposed to look one way or not the other. And the formats by year, looking at all those different things, credential numbers come into play as well. So there are multiple avenues for verifying those things. Sometimes you can even go on the university website and find whether or not this person completed this thesis in this year. If they did, it's likely that they studied there and they graduated. So there's all sorts of different ways that you can use to verify credentials, depending on your circumstances, your organization's or institution's requirements for verification. Now we're dealing with credential equivalence, which is more a matter of general credential evaluation methodology than it is China specific, but there are certain particular aspect of Chinese education that we need to address here. So for instance, recognition and accreditation. In China, I sort of was taught that it is institutional recognition, but I have come to the conclusion over the years of working with Chinese credentials that while generally speaking, recognition of programs in China is institutional, there are a lot of instances where recognition is programmatic, which means that institutions may or may not be recognized. But then within those recognized universities or colleges, some programs may not be recognized. And that's the part that we really have to remember and keep in mind, that programs existing within recognized educational institutions also need to be sort of looked at for their specific features. Now, if you're dealing with your standard bachelor's degree, master's degree, doctoral degree, or your lower level undergraduate Zhuangke program, you may not need to worry so much, especially if you have a final credential and you've verified it. But if you're dealing with an incomplete program for which you only have a transcript, that's where programmatic recognition and whether or not this particular program is recognized becomes really, really relevant. And then when we're dealing with the level, we talked about how the Chinese educational system is US based. So most of the time you will be able to find a direct equivalent, except some of the cross-level programs we'll talk about in a little bit, and professional programs. So let's look at that in a bit more detail. For US-based levels, we have your high school diploma, your Zhuangke, which is a lower level undergraduate program, which generally equates to an associate's degree. Your Benka programs, which generally would equate to a bachelor's degree if there is a degree. Your master's programs, the same thing. In China, it's possible to graduate with a diploma, but not get a degree. And then you have your doctoral programs as well. Now, professional programs are tricky. I do not have pharmacy here, and Lindsay and I were just talking about a pharmacy China program before this session. But in general, your professional programs, you need to look at them with a lot of diligence, because medicine, dentistry, physical therapy, law, engineering, in some instances, nursing, in China, those programs are not the same in duration, requirements, either or, as they are in the US. Admission requirements are different. Say, for instance, to study medicine in China, you need a high school diploma, and then you go directly into a 5-year medicine program and you're a doctor. Obviously, it's not the same in the US. In the US, you need a high school diploma, then a bachelor's degree, and then you go to med school. So it is very different. And in that sense, you would have students potentially that come to you with a bachelor's degree in medicine, and they want you to evaluate their credential as a doctor of medicine degree, but it isn't. So that's where it gets really tricky. Now, in China, what adds to it being tricky is the fact that professional programs can be secondary. In China, I've seen clinical medicine secondary diplomas. I've seen nursing diplomas at the secondary level, teacher training diplomas, accounting diplomas. Those are meant as professional credentials to enter the workforce at the very lowest rung of this profession. But say a nursing diploma from a secondary vocational school kind of looks like a nursing diploma from a 4-year undergraduate program, and it has the same duration. So be mindful of the fact that those exist. You will be prepared to look critically at credentials that you receive and their translations to make sure that you don't give an equivalence of a bachelor's degree, which you might not, because there's no degree, in fact, but you don't give the equivalence of 4 years of undergraduate work for something that was done at the secondary level. So as we saw, there are some aspects of this that are easy and some that are kind of complicated. So for regular programs, it can be really easy. Once you've seen a ton of them, you will be able to tell right away what you're looking at. But when it comes to non-standard programs, some of what we talked about above, it gets a little more complicated. And now we're going to take a look at that a little bit. So non-standard programs, what I call them, it's probably something that deviates the most from the US-based system of education that we talked about. So you have your secondary vocational programs we just mentioned. You have your cross-level programs, which sometimes you would call them junior college programs, which is a 5-year program that spans secondary and post-secondary education. And you end up with a 5-year credential that can be misleading, but in reality equates to 2 years associate after high school. And then you have your exam prep programs for self-study education in China. And then some transnational programs. For instance, a student may be taking preparatory coursework in their country, which is China in our case, but they won't really have anything transferable or any credit unless they finish that program and they take those examinations that are administered by the authority that issues the final credential. So if you're preparing for taking those exams, but you haven't yet taken them, technically, domestically within China, you will have nothing that you can transfer. You only have a credential after that examination has been taken. So that's the part that's tricky. You can think of it as, say, a GED in the US. Maybe you're sitting there studying for your algebra and your language arts and your social studies, but until you've actually sat that test, you have nothing to show for it. This is very similar. And I sort of put preparatory apart a little bit. It's because a lot of international departments at Chinese universities deliver those preparatory study abroad programs with the assumption that you can go to the United States, for instance, and apply those 2 years of undergraduate work to a traditional bachelor program at a US university. However, the program itself at a Chinese university, if the student fails to get a visa, for instance, or they don't have the funding to go, that credit is worth nothing. It is non-transferable. So essentially it is non-credit in the originating system in China, but it's hard to tell because that program was delivered at a university. So we're going to talk about a little bit about how to identify those things. Now I'm going to have to speed up a little bit. I get carried away. This is a subject that fascinates me, even though I know a lot about it. So this is just a sample of a credential that is a graduation certificate issued at a lower level undergraduate level, but it says that it's a 5-year program. And some people may equate this to 5 years of undergraduate work, or even wonder if it's an equivalent of a bachelor's degree because it exceeds its duration. But this is what we talked about earlier. It is just a 3-year high school program plus 2 years of undergraduate education. Now you have these two credentials. Does anybody want to tell me what kind of credential we're looking at by looking at this big blue title over here?
That would be a graduation certificate.
Perfect. Yes, it is. And those are very distinctive characters that are, you know, they just become second nature just looking at them and knowing immediately what it is. So it is a graduation certificate, and it looks kind of like a graduation certificate from a lower level undergraduate program. But it's actually a secondary credential, and there are some areas over here in red that I've highlighted that actually pinpoint to that. And you'll be like, oh, I'll never remember this. Well, I'll be giving you like a handout at the end of the presentation where all those characters will be collected in one spot, and you'll be able to use them if you ever need to identify the level of the credential in addition to what credential that is. All right, so here I've collected sort of the telltale signs that you should be considering a credential you're looking at twice, and don't necessarily rely on the translation. Whenever you see something that says international, be suspicious. Whenever you see something that says group somewhere in the title or under the title, be suspicious. Continuing education, yes. Summer programs, don't get me started on those, yes. Completion versus graduation, that is a red flag. School, when you're looking at the character school, except in very rare instances, they will refer to secondary, be it vocational or academic, and they will very rarely refer to post-secondary education. So that can be a telltale sign. And then self-study for the reasons we talked about above, where studying for an examination and taking an examination are not one and the same. This is a transcript that looks neat. It's issued by Jinan University Education College. So all of everything that we're looking for to confirm the level of this program is here, right? So it has the words university, Taxia, great. It has the words college, great. So it's a college within a university. It's a transcript. We found the characters for that. Yay, we should continue and evaluate it for credit. But one of the, on the list of our red flag words, we have this word that says center. Whenever you see something like this is another red flag for us, because university and college is great, but once a program is delivered at a center within that university or college, this is where you should get suspicious. And then we start looking at other features of this document. You may not be able to read Chinese, but you have 2016 and 2017. So it's a 1-year program. When we reviewed the educational system, we really didn't see a 1-year program, did we? That should be a red flag number 2. This is the duration of this program. So it's either an incomplete program or it's something else. Then we can look and see that every course is worth 3 credits, which in China is mildly unusual. Usually you would have 3 credit courses interspersed with 1 credit courses, sometimes 0.5 courses. Majority of them may be 3, but it's never just across the board like this. And you have a program at the bottom, it says 54 total credits, and it conveniently gives us a GPA for each subject, which for China is highly unusual as well. So all of those things should tell you that you should investigate this credential further and shouldn't take it at face value that because it's delivered at a university, it's all of a sudden supposed to be worth credit. In this case, it was very hard, even for me, when I was researching these programs. But it turns out that this is a preparatory program for a self-study examination. And it's delivered at a center that is affiliated with the university and kind of located within the campus, but it's an unrecognized institution. So in China, these credits are worth nothing. You cannot use them to transfer to a different department of the same university. And the university website even stated, this particular institution is only affiliated with us in terms of teaching preparatory coursework for our self-study examinations. This is an extreme example to illustrate just how important it is to assess the entirety of the credential versus just look at your primary markers like university or college. This is a highlight of the importance of researching recognition of each program that doesn't result in a verified degree or diploma. Call me paranoid, but it saved me many times. And I'm sure for you, Karen and Lindsay, you have dealt with plenty of situations where doing the due diligence was extremely important. Now you're wondering, okay, I don't speak Mandarin. I don't plan on learning it. Aside from learning these credential sort of identifiers, what else can I do? And this is just a suggestion. Your colleagues at other institutions can be a great asset, especially those who occupy the same role as you, potentially an admissions counselor, or for you, Robin, since you work amongst other credential evaluators with a lot of experience, you're set. Then there's the NAFSA ACE, which is Admissions and Credential Evaluation Network. You don't have to be a member of NAFSA to use it. And this is a message board where a lot of messages are posted by evaluators of different institutions asking questions about specific credentials. Then there's the Connection, which part of this platform is free, is powered by ECE. And there's also a message board there where people ask credential evaluation related questions. And then you can obviously reach out to an evaluation agency to ask those questions as well. We won't turn you down. Now, there's a lot of avenues to find your information and utilize those, especially if you meet a colleague at a conference or something like this. It can be a good resource to reach out to as you run across things that maybe are unfamiliar or challenging to you.